Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
Today's episode reflects on Clayton Christensen. And this guy was a Harvard Business School professor. He was a consultant. And many of you probably know about him because of his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which came out in 1997. That book introduced his theory of disruptive innovation. Well, Christensen died on January 23rd, 2020. And we were thinking about this, and it reminded us of one of our favorite works of his. And our favorite work is not actually The Innovator's Dilemma, although that's really great and it was very influential. But we were thinking in particular about a 2010 article that published in Harvard Business Review titled, How Will You Measure Your Life? He also wrote a book of the same title, and you can find out all about him, his life, and his work on his website, which is claytonchristensen.com, and we'll post a link to that in the show notes. So today we're talking about how will you measure your life? So what are we going to talk about today, Chris?
Yeah, so Ben, in this episode, we're going to talk about what does it mean to create a strategy for your life. We're going to talk about ethics and integrity matter because people remember. You know, we all remember the people in our lives that lack that integrity. And choosing your metrics for success. So how are you going to measure your success? And all of this applies to everyone, regardless of your career, what you do. If you happen to be in business, we think these topics are of special relevance and are super important to remember. But Ben, there was a quote in that article that both resonated with you. Why don't you go ahead and read that now?
Sure. So in this article, How Will You Measure Your Life? Christensen wrote, management is the most noble of professions if it's practiced well. No other occupation offers as many ways to help others learn and grow, take responsibility and be recognized for achievement, and contribute to the success of a team. More and more MBA students come to school thinking that a career in business means buying, selling, and investing in companies. That's unfortunate. Doing deals doesn't yield the deep rewards that come from building up people. End quote. And I just think that that's such an amazing way to think about things, and it really resonates with how I think about leadership and management. I know it resonates with how you view leadership and management, and really even the work that we do with companies.
Right. Yeah. When you're out in the business environment, either with our consulting clients, our executives that we coach, in the military, all those places, some of the biggest times in my life have been when people have taken the time to develop me, right? But one of the things I see in all those environments is people are focused on get to work, do the job, try to get the promotion so Bill or Nancy doesn't get it, How do I drive this result, have this report? And it's no wonder that that's the case, because generally that's how, performance reviews and how managers view this guy gets results. Mm-hmm. But the main part of this life, in my view, is actually building up other people, having individuals at all levels of the organization. It doesn't have to be leadership or managers that build each other up. That can be both encouragement, but also having something in your life, skills, knowledge, abilities, and like integrity in a way in which you live your life that adds to the lives around you.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's just important to pause and think about these questions that we're going to raise today in the episode earlier rather than later. These are questions that sometimes I think arise at, towards the end of people's careers, maybe once people retire. And, it's great to be thinking about these at any stage. But I think it's particularly important when you're perhaps earlier on or mid-career because you can make some course corrections. And these types of ways of thinking and these types of questions that we're going to talk about today oftentimes can influence your decision-making about what types of jobs to take, or perhaps even more prevalent, like how you're going to behave within your current role. So let's start off with this first part, which is, what does it mean to create a strategy for your life?
Yeah, Ben, I always like to think of the backwards planning thing here. Start with the end in mind, right?
Right.
Now, one theme, these articles tend to do well on LinkedIn and Facebook, where the top 5 regrets of the dying, or
Hmm.
all these themes about looking back, and it's generally about the regrets. And I think that's not bad. It's here's a signpost. Hey, you whippersnappers, pay attention, right? Um, but we can't end up somewhere if we, it's unlikely we're going to end up there where we want to be on accident. So we
Hmm.
do, like you said, need to have a strategy for your life. And, one of those things, start with the end in mind. What would you want on your epitaph? Or when you're
Yeah.
sitting on a porch, you're too old to walk anywhere. What memories and things do you want to have in your life and reflections as you look back?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of this is, thinking about the end in mind, and the end being the fact that last time I checked, the mortality rate is 100%. So we are all going to die at some point. And how do you want to be remembered? How do you want, like you said, what types of memories do you want to have? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? And part of the thrust that Christensen gets at in this article is he's saying, we do all this stuff in business where we think about, for example, your strategy, how you're going to compete and win, how you're going to create a vision and a mission that everyone can get behind and that are motivational and so forth. And so we do these for organizations. But there's probably some value in thinking about what is your vision, what do you want to aspire to become, as well as your mission. What is your personal reason for existence for your life?
Right. Yeah, I think that's good. So,
Yeah.
one of the things for me is also this idea of like mortality salience.
Yeah.
Right. So that, like you said, the fatality rate's 100%, or the mortality rate's
Right.
100%.
That's
So,
right.
for me, I grew up as a person of faith. I'm no longer a person of faith. So one of the things that really drives me is my view that after this earth, that's it for me.
Mm.
So a big driver is this is the time I have. I need to be a good steward of that for myself.
Hmm.
Ben, you've had some unique experiences around some of that mortality salience.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing that I have is I have a daily reminder of mortality, in that my backyard has a cemetery right behind it. So,
Yeah, I'm always.
and you've been to my house many times. It's
It's
there, and
beautiful. It's a
it is.
historical cemetery.
Yeah, but it's funny because it actually kind of, for some people, like it weirds them out. Like we've had people are like, oh, there's a cemetery in your backyard. And I'm like, yeah, there's a cemetery in my backyard. And the joke I always use is, it's the best part of town. Everybody's dying to get in here, right?
Right.
But
Or it's
dun-dun-dun.
okay. My kids are already weird.
Yeah. So, but it is a reminder that, hey, like, this is not permanent, right? And whether or not you believe in an afterlife or not, that matters for how you behave here, right? It really does matter what kind of life you have. So that's one reminder that I have on a regular basis. In this article that we're talking about today, Christensen actually, it's kind of interesting, given that he died, not too long ago, here at the end of January 2020. In that article, he actually mentions that that he was diagnosed recently with cancer and so forth. And that article came out 10 years ago. So he was obviously thinking about those things then, and he probably had some incidents that happened, with regards to his health, that gave him this mortality salience, which is this idea, this awareness that, mortality salience is about this, the psychological awareness that you're not going to be around forever. I also had an incident about 2 years ago, when I was, this is just kind of one of those events that reminds you of things, and reminds you of your own mortality and what could have happened, right? So I was driving at night on an interstate, and just out of nowhere, something smashed into my windshield. I was driving probably about 70 miles an hour, and I was in the left lane, and somehow I very quickly navigated into the median. And when I kind of struggled to open my eyes, because there was glass in my eyes, I just saw this huge piece of metal like shoved through the windshield, just like right down. It actually came through the windshield right in front of me, hit me in the arm, and sprayed a bunch of glass in my eyes.
It's so crazy. We
We
got to post the pictures, Ben. You got to post them.
Maybe we will. I mean, I have photos because I took a picture of it right away. I was like, "Holy smokes, this is crazy!" And if that thing would have come through at a different angle, it would have hit me right in the face. And so, I had some corneal abrasions, which actually recover, in about a week. So my eyes got better, and I'm fine and everything. But it's one of these kind of wake up moments. It was like, oh my gosh, like, life is not just something that you should take for granted. And actually, prior to that drive, I had been talking with some people about, the idea of starting my own consulting firm because, I had been consulting for a number of years, but wanted to kind of do my own thing. And, after that happened, I was like, yeah, we're doing this. Let's make this happen. And then, in May of 2018 was when we actually founded our firm, Indigo Anchor. And, part of my motivation was like, hey, this stuff is short. I'm just going to go for this and do this. And it's been fantastic ever since. But, I don't think you have to have those types of experiences necessarily to be aware of your own potential or your own eventual demise.
Yeah, you don't have to stick your hand in the burner to know that it's hot and will hurt you, right?
That's right. That's right. But I think part of what we're talking about here today is about having that awareness and taking the time to think about, what is my strategy for life? What is my vision? What is my mission? What is the meaning that I want to have?
Right. And, one of the first things, that's part of your strategy needs to be allocating your resources, right? There's an opportunity cost. So let's say if I wanted to stop right now and get my PhD in Sumerian pottery, which, I guess that's a thing, right? So no offense to Sumerian pottery experts everywhere. But there would be an opportunity cost. I'd have to move out of my house because on a, graduate stipend, I couldn't, and those would be earnings I wouldn't have. I remember some conversations I had actually with, so I had a really interesting first sergeant. He was my platoon sergeant, and then he was my first sergeant, Dr. Pryor. And he's actually in charge of the USDA lab down at Auburn University. So that's something unique about the Guard. You really get odd people in odd spots. So normally, you don't have a sergeant first class or something with a PhD. But he was a big mentor for me in a lot of ways. And I remember, and it was so great that he'd even take the time to share his life in these ways. But I was, got out of grad school, I'm doing work, and I'm having to start to make choices because I'm used to having enough time before kids to get all my reading done, do some hobbies. And he really talked about like, hey, as you become more valuable in different ways, you're going to have to start making decisions of this over that. And I was really sad to hear that, but he was right. It came very quickly having to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't do everything. You just can't. And every moment that you spend doing something is a moment that you're not doing something else. It's a simple statement, but it's a profound idea. This idea of opportunity cost, that whenever you're working on something, you're spending time on some project or in some job or whatever, you're not doing something else. And I think it's important for us to realize that in terms of what we're giving up when we're saying yes to things. And part of this, I think, is just by, being present with those around you. A big part of when people are looking back at their lives and maybe having some of those regrets as they're dying, one of them is about, not spending the time to foster and maintain interpersonal relationships. We even know from the science on aging and dementia and so forth, that having a good interpersonal network and interacting with people on a regular basis is really healthy, physically, mentally, and it just makes for a more meaningful life.
Right. And we don't get to pick where we're born, right? So, oh man, I wasn't born in some like high-end Silicon Valley enclave where I had a, chef and a scribe and had fencing. That doesn't matter. Actually, the most interesting stories come from all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
But being present with those around you allows you to learn, to grow, to thrive, and to build those relationships that will sustain you through your life.
Right.
Time's not on your side, right? The Rolling Stones, they were wrong, right?
Oh, the Stones were wrong. I love the Stones, but yes, I think they were wrong about this one. Time is generally not on our side. It keeps on going, and I think actually Bruce Springsteen probably had a little bit more correct when he said that time slips away, leaves you with nothing, mister, but boring stories of glory days, right?
Good. We're dating ourselves.
Oh,
well, hey, we both have kids. I got this Dr. Seuss quote here. How did it get so late so soon? It's night before it's afternoon. December is here before it's June. My goodness, how the time has flown. How did it get so late so soon?
Yeah.
So thanks for that, Dr. Seuss. So, Ben, let's talk about ethics, integrity matter because people remember. Right?
Sure. So we talked about, what a strategy is for your life and why that matters. Now, let's turn our attention to this idea of ethics and integrity. And I think one way for us to think about this, obviously, this is not a philosophy course. Millennia of, thought has been dedicated to these ideas about what is truth, what is right, what is wrong, where do these things come from?
What is ethics even? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And we're not going to, get into that too deeply because I think that's maybe a series of 1,000 podcasts that someone else should probably do. But, from our experience and also just from kind of how we think about things, we can start with this idea of where ethics come from, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so there are a bunch of different ways in which we develop our ethical understanding about what's right and what's wrong. Certainly starts in early childhood, right?
Yeah, poor kids. They're just bebopping, trying to do whatever they want to do, and there's these daggone parents that keep guiding them or scolding them or directing them. It's got to be miserable to be a young child knowing nothing, right?
Right. Well, children are not. When you're just born, you aren't really equipped with the knowledge and skills to interact in society well. And so it is necessary, in my view, to help to civilize the little rascals in a way to help them understand how to make decisions, what right and wrong is. And, we also get our ethics from some of our life experiences, things that happen to us, certainly from our religious beliefs. So that's still a very big part of how I think about the world and what I ascribe to in terms of my values and my beliefs, are codes of ethics that we may have, and some of this even comes from, thinking of codes of ethics. So for example, you and I are both in the military and, we have codes of conduct and things and core values that are really quite robust and strong and are reemphasized on a regular basis. That is ideally, and I think it does work to some degree, helps to create a common platform for understanding these ideas of how to make decisions and what is right and wrong.
Yeah, and we have discussions with others, which is super important. And one of these things that's interesting is all of this stuff, and we'll talk about how culture becomes, accidental culture. It just kind of emerges out of the primordial ooze of nothingness, right? So, most of us, as in our childhood, did not have director of philosophies from Duke University, raising us, right? Our life experience may be insular. You have some major horrible life experience that changes how you view the world, but maybe the only person to have it. And maybe you draw the wrong conclusions there, right? And I use the term wrong loosely. Your religious beliefs, those may change. If you were raised, one faith, sometimes you change your faith. Code of ethics, those could be really awesome. But maybe you're in the mob and, maybe that's not the best code of ethics, right, to have. But then some of these ideas, when we start to, so those are kind of like amorphous. They grow out of kind of a collective roots wisdom, oftentimes. But, we can actually start to reach to the pros too. We could look at ethical philosophers, classic ethical dilemmas to explore. Like, there's a train, right? And you can change the track, right? And there's 100 people that will die if it keeps going the one way, but if you pull it, like your kid's gonna get run over by the train on the other. That's right. One of the 101 ones. But looking at those ethical dilemmas, and we're just sitting with our buddies that maybe don't study philosophy or something, we may not come to the best thoughts on those, right? So, just making a stab at, you should probably take a look at some ethical philosophy. There's people way smarter than me. I was like, man, I would never come up with those ideas on my own. Maybe start where the conversation's left off rather than reinventing the wheel on your own. That could be good. And then the final idea is like our experiences in organizations. So we look at what the ethics, how business gets done around here. And a lot of people that I see just kind of adopt the mores of the broader organization.
Right. Which can be a good thing and a bad thing, right? So if the mores of the broader organization are ones that are, have kind of gone off the rails over time, it can be very powerfully, it can influence you, and you can start to believe that is the way that things should be done. And so that's something we'll talk about later. Like, how do you disrupt that, and what kinds of things does that take? But what's interesting is that these, the sense of ethics thinks of what is right and wrong, and how do you live your life. All the things we're talking about here today, over time, they become part of your identity to some degree. It's part of your sense of who you are, your sense of self, or your preferred sense of self. Like, this is who I want to be. So in my decision-making and in my actions, I'm going to try to close that gap between who I really am in my actual behaviors and who I want to become, this aspirational thing. And that can be useful, right? And because we have this ingrained in our identity and who we think we are, there are things that maybe you do or don't do simply because of who you are, right? Or who you have become or are becoming. And I think about myself, like there are certain things that I just would never do. There are some things that I would always do with regard to how I interact with others, decisions I would make in business and so forth. Because they're that rooted in my sense of self and things that I've developed over time.
Right. And, that brings us back to that same idea, which is sometimes you need to examine your identity against an external criteria, right?
Right.
You may need to change. So if you've just accidentally evolved, maybe maybe your parents were the only ones that fed something into your stuff. I think about that scripture, raise up a child in the way that they should go. But, for me, I wasn't raised by pro philosophers or pro people of faith so sometimes it's great to reach out for that external thing and examine, do I need to change? If you were raised in the mob, right? It wouldn't take too much to look at moral philosophy and stuff and come up with, maybe a life of crime's not the best way to go about this thing.
Right. And so, there's kind of this downside to always, thinking about, I should always be authentic to who I am, because what if who you are, or, some of the ideas that you've ascribed to as you've grown up, what if some of those are wrong? Or what if some of those are really damaging to other people? And I think, so the mob is actually an interesting example, because you could think of, organized crime and breaking the law all the time. Most of us would probably agree it's not a great way to go. But at least from what I watched in the movies, and I think some what I know also just from how the mob
We've done no
operates.
consulting engagements with the mob.
Let's make that clear. And neither of us have ever been in the mob, but they do actually have some really strong ethical principles around, for example, family and loyalty and friendship and those types of things. It's just kind of twisted, right? And but you can think of people who grew up in maybe an abusive environment, right, where they got this really twisted idea of what a proper relationship looks like and what that should entail, or maybe some sort of a cult of some sort. So I think we do need to, as we go through our lives, continually ensure that what we're doing and being true to ourselves or whatever, that we're actually being true to something that is external to us. I think that that's helpful. And that's where, so for my example, a lot of what I would be comparing myself with would be things from my religious faith, right? So I'm a practicing Catholic, and that's, I like to think of it, and I've joked with you about it, like the Catholic Church is actually a perfectly designed behavioral modification system that if you do it the way it's supposed to be, it actually does a lot of really good for yourself in terms of examining, who you are, what you're doing, being critical of your own, wants and desires and actions, and making course corrections along the way. So I think there's a lot of value in realizing that, just because you really feel strongly about something, you probably need to sometimes question yourself a little bit.
Right. And that's one thing I really respect about you, Ben, as a secular person, as you really do live out your faith. And I see that in the lives of both your children and how your family life is conducted. You guys have an amazing family, one that I aspire to be more like, actually. One thing I also want to bring up is this idea when we talk about, we get our ethics either accidentally, we absorb them from maybe some good examples or bad examples, or we go the pro route as a student of ethical philosophy. As that become part of our identity, and in the book Difficult Conversations, we did a podcast on that, on difficult conversation. Identity is one of those key things that people will throw their arms up or run screaming out the door when you start talking about identity. So if you want to grow in this area, if you want to examine yourself against some kind of external criteria, right? Just know that that's going to be sensitive for you automatically, right? So you might, and I hate to use the term because it's just kind of charged, but you might want to find a safe place, right? To explore these items. Make sure that you're with people you can trust that have your best interest in mind as you're starting to do that stuff.
Right, because some of those fundamental questions about identity are, am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of love? Like these are pretty big questions. And when we like to feel secure about things. And sometimes we can be very good at tricking ourselves into believing that we are doing the right thing. And when that foundation starts to get shaken, it's very helpful and appropriate to be around those people who have your best interests in mind. When we do a lot of work with executives and with organizations, one thing that you and I come across with regard to, especially more as you ascend the corporate hierarchy, so to speak, or whatever, people in those positions, if they don't have the moral compass that they need to guide themselves in those situations, it's really problematic, right? This is something where I feel like you've really got to build that moral compass along the way so that you're ready when you're in those positions of power and authority.
Right. I always say that you got to, to use the war example, how much should you work out before a deployment? I mean, all the workouts probably. You don't want to be in a clutch situation and not able to sprint a quarter mile as fast as you need to sprint a quarter mile. And some of that mentality can come to there. Now, does that mean that you don't ever binge watch some Netflix? There's got to be some balance here, right? We're allocating our resources in an appropriate way, and we got to take care of ourselves while we do that. But there will be times if you don't develop a strong moral compass while you're young, it's never too late to start, right? But if there can be times when temptations and the demands of life will exceed your ability to navigate in a moral way or your practiced, disciplined self-control. And they actually, like in business, we call it the Bathsheba syndrome. So, Ben, what's the Bathsheba syndrome?
Yeah. So the Bathsheba syndrome comes from this article that was published in the Journal of Business Ethics a number of years ago. And it describes the phenomenon that occurs when you are in a position of authority, right? So and the idea here is that, good people can end up doing bad things, not necessarily just because there's, hyper competition or they have goals that are just somehow kind of get misaligned with what's right. But it actually can happen due to your own success. And what I mean by that, and what they describe in this article, and I guess maybe we should go back and say who the heck is Bathsheba. So if you haven't read, some of the Old Testament in the Bible, Bathsheba was the object of affection, we'll say, for King David, and King David basically
that's like the least juicy way to say it. So let me fix this here. So David, and I'll probably screw it up, so I don't remember it right, but we'll put a link to the Bible verse in the show notes. But as I remember it, David's sitting on the roof, right, and he looks over and he sees this lady bathing, and is like, "Yeah." Right?
I think that's pretty much what happened. Yeah.
and then he finds out he's actually the wife of, go ahead, Ben.
Uriah, I believe, right? So yeah, Uriah is her husband, and he essentially orchestrates his murder. So there's a battle going on. This guy's in the army or and so basically David orchestrates for him to be at the front lines. And he knew that he was just going to get slaughtered. And so, he did that so that he could make his move on Bathsheba. And so
it's like straight out, it could be a modern soap opera story.
I know, right? And so this idea is that, okay, he was in a position of power and authority. He was a very successful leader up to that point. And the idea is that as we find ourselves in these positions of power and authority, there are some different benefits and some disadvantages that happen there. So, for example, at the personal level, as a person with more authority, you tend to have more privileged access. You start to have the ability to know things about different things that are going on. You start to get more status and influence. You maybe have a bigger network, so to speak, and this can be a good thing, right? But it also can start to make you feel like you have this inflated sense of your own worth, right? And this is a negative. Your inflated belief in your personal ability, and you start to, have this unbalanced personal life. You start to have this really inflated ego. It certainly can be stressful, and that just comes due to the fact that you were successful in your role. At the organizational level, when you are more senior in an organization, you start to have more control over resources. You have fewer people looking over your shoulder. There's not as much direct supervision. You have the ability to kind of set the agenda and to control resources and decision making, how things happen. And you also can experience kind of a loss of strategic focus where you are, getting complacent about things. And what I think we should take away from this idea of the Bathsheba syndrome is that you need to be careful as you ascend in an organization's hierarchy and you start to have more access to information, more control over resources and outcomes. You start to, believe your own, tales that you tell yourself about how great you are. You need to realize that you've got to stay humble. You've got to surround yourself with people who are going to give you the no kidding truth about what's right and what's wrong and where you might be going off the rails, because you as a person are ill-equipped to do that on your own.
Right. Just don't take a personal bias to yourself. It's extremely unlikely you're immune, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else falls on this. Don't think I won't fall on this. Be aware. They'd be super great. Like one of the things I think about, when we had the big economic fallout from the mortgage crisis and all that stuff, was this idea, this terminology came about, moral hazard, right? And I remember hearing interviews like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't share, maybe we shouldn't sell arcane derivatives that we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, oh, well, now we're going to start teaching our young minted MBAs what moral hazard is. And, as somebody who grew up, Boy Scouts was a big part of my life growing up, and who grew up in the church, and, these kinds of morality plays, biblical lessons, these kinds of things were so key to starting me off on my moral journey and ethical journey. I'm just like, what the heck? How do you get through college and graduate school, often at top elite universities, and you have no flipping clue what a moral hazard is? And it's because we accidentally come on these things. It's not deliberate in us developing a moral compass and ethics, deciding what kind of person I want to be. I see this all the time with managers. And I've seen some, I don't want to be doom and gloom. I've seen some amazing people of ethics and integrity, people who, just always freaking do the right thing. And they're like a beacon of light. But I see this all the time. They're just so obsessed with winning, so obsessed with, metrics, getting promoted, that they totally miss this idea of moral hazard, right? And which is just like we see this in companies all the time. They're focused on that quarter's results, that they don't build sustaining success because they're missing out on the strategic things. So don't be that manager, right? Let's, not be accidental in choosing how we decide what is wrong. We got to chart our course. So great. Select from a better buffet of choices. If you got a bunch of numbskull friends that don't know right or wrong or aren't philosophy pros, maybe that's not your only buffet of choices, right?
Yeah.
We can, I love that quote, stand on the shoulders of giants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Start where the conversation's left off. And if you're not a big reader, I'm a big advocate of reading. However, I know, in teaching my kids to read and watching struggles there, reading doesn't come easy for everybody. I can't tell you how many CEOs I know that must do Audible because they just struggle with the reading piece. That's fine. Podcasts are great. Just fine. You got to get the information out there.
Yeah. And I think getting outside of your own bubble is really important. So you mentioned, if you're surrounded by a bunch of numbskulls, guess what? You're probably going to turn into one of them in some way. We are social creatures. We oftentimes will, adapt to the people who are around us. The people who are around us and the ways in which they behave start to inform what we think is normal and right or appropriate. And, that's why, one of the, when I think about parenting, for example, I think one of the most important things that you can do is teaching your children how to choose good friends. Because
so perfect. Yes.
Yeah. And I think, this follows you into adulthood. Like you surround yourselves with people who are, kind of teetering on the edge of unethical behavior or, doing things that seem a little bit off. You're going to start to think in the ways that they do. And so it's very important to surround yourselves with people who are people of integrity and have this, at least have a questioning attitude and an awareness and a non-accidental approach towards developing character and ethics.
And once you practice this for a while, and I'll talk about kind of what the beginning of that journey looks like, but once you practice for a while, we started off with that quote at the beginning. One of the best things in life is developing those around you. You can get those skills in difficult conversations and start to pull up the ethics, pull up the ethics of the person to your left and right. Hey, Fred, we can do better than that. Hey, Fred, that's not part of our values and how we do business around here. Super, super important. There's not a lot of people that can do that well, and it's because they haven't started that journey. So
Right.
Yeah, so intent matters. So when you start this journey, you gotta kind of realize, at least for me, I said, ooh, I need a serious upgrade. I need a serious upgrade to some of the ways I think about these things, I was doing pretty good compared to my friends, compared to the people of my left and right in different social settings and stuff. But that's okay. I really think intent matters. So inaction itself is an action, so you
Mm-hmm.
got to start making moral choices right now. But good intentions need to be backed by better actions over times.
What's that one quote that good intention, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Right?
Yeah, or if we want to keep mining the Bible here, faith without works is dead.
That's right. That's right.
You got to start backing this up, but don't be scared, because I see some people, like, I'm just scared I'm going to say or do the wrong thing. Hey, buddy, you're in this game whether you want to or not. Check yourself. Make sure you have a good intent, that intent being to grow on your, kind of moral compass journey, and set out. That's this
right.
idea of like deliberate living versus conformity. Being very specific about those steps you take, which, rests under that talking about allocating your resources.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so part of this is just about having awareness that you are making choices on a daily basis. And these small decisions you make about, how you're going to spend your time, the people you're going to associate with, all of these things add up. And, if we're not careful, we'll just kind of end up doing what's easy, what's popular, and really just kind of conforming to whatever the kind of median level of behavior is. And I just think that that's not really the best way to go, right?
Yeah, like you don't want to be the guy at Enron that was like, oh yeah, you're at your next job interview. Oh yeah, I worked at Enron. Yeah, we just drove off the cliff together.
Yeah.
We were friends the whole way. Happy hours were great.
And it's interesting. So going back to the How Will You Measure Your Life article by Clay Christensen, he actually mentions in the article, he said, you know what? I think it was Jeff Skilling, one of the guys at Enron. He said, I knew him. He was in my Harvard Business School class and he was a good dude. Right?
Yeah.
like if you're not careful, like you can become the person who makes those terrible decisions. You already mentioned this earlier, but the minute that you start thinking that you are immune to being that person, is the minute when you start going down the wrong path, in my view, because evil is not something. It's not a line between people, right? The choice between right and wrong. It's actually a division within each one of us. That we all have the capacity to be evil. We all have the capacity to be good. And I think at least thinking that way can be helpful and give us a wariness about our own behavior.
That's right. And if you think this is an exhortation to the path of better living, it is.
Yeah.
We're just going to own that right now.
Right. So I mean, the path to righteousness is hard, but it's very rewarding. Or to virtue. And it's interesting. It just reminds me of. So there's a great book by Russ Roberts. He's the host of a great podcast too called Econ Talk. Go check it out. But he wrote a book a couple years ago called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But what he talks about in that book.
I hear some groaning from some people with certain economic perspectives.
Well, I challenge them to read this book because Adam Smith taught, he's best known as kind of the father of economics and the father of capitalism from his book, The Wealth of Nations and so forth. But in this book by Russ Roberts, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, he focuses instead on a lesser known but very important book by Adam Smith called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that book, Adam Smith describes how all of us, all people, desire not only to be loved, but also to be lovely. Right? We want people's respect. We want people's admiration, but we also want to feel like we can deserve it. And then he talks about how there's two paths towards achieving that. One is through wealth and fame, and the other is through a life of virtue. And then he discusses how the life of virtue is the better path, which is very interesting because this is the father of capitalism, right? And he's talking about
hard to argue with that.
Yeah,
if you want to be a lovely person, be a person of virtue.
Right. And
awesome.
This goes into how you're going to measure your life, how you're going to allocate your time and resources, what you're going to pay attention to. Ethics and integrity. These things really do matter. And I think this brings us to kind of some ideas even around leadership.
Right. So, one example I'm thinking of, or you've got to make a decision as a CEO, right? Mm-hmm. And there's some pressure on several sides of an issue, and neither one of them's necessarily illegal, right?
Right.
How do you choose? Do you, do you cave to pressure from the board of directors because they think that you need to take this certain strategy, but you think it has moral hazard? Or, there's going to be things. This isn't just massively like some Enron debacle. But having that clear moral compass makes those decisions. It's just like snap, snap, snap. So much easier to make. So Ben, let's talk about choosing some metrics for success.
Well, before we go there, I just think that you need to prepare yourself in those leadership situations to be a social deviant when necessary. You may need to really stand out from the crowd. That's essentially what leadership is. It's about moving in a different direction a lot of times, and you just love it that there's something positive associated with being a social deviant. I think, right? That's why you love it.
I mean, so many of our engagements, though, were brought in to change things, right? And people can look at us, especially when we're dealing with toxic cultures. When we're brought into an organization, like the culture is toxic and everything, doing the right thing in those cultures can seem deviant.
Right. And that's what in the military we call this moral courage, right? There's physical courage, which is like, I'm going to, go out on that convoy, even though it's the same route that people got blown up on last week, right? And you and I have experience there, and similar types of experiences. But then there's also moral courage, where I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to dissent when necessary, even if everybody is thinking one way. I'm going to say the unpopular thing because I think it's right. And what's interesting is that we know from a lot of experiments in social psychology that when one person dissents, you will oftentimes get other people to agree with you, right? Because there are other people who are self-censoring and not speaking up, but once they hear one person kind of break that, that veil of unanimity, then people will start to think differently. So
and if you have an underdeveloped moral compass, it's going to be harder to break ranks, right?
Yep.
But if you have a really defined moral compass, you really know what needs to happen, and you can make those decisions, and it's a beacon to others, honestly.
Yes. Great. So now we can let's move on to this last part. Let's talk about choosing your metrics for success. What does success look like? So obviously there's a lot of common types of metrics. What are some of the common ones we see that people kind of the default mode, the unthinking path for what it means to be successful?
Look at my salary. You had like, I'm doing so well, 6 figures.
Sweet. Yeah. I got promoted. I got this title. I achieved whatever by whatever age.
Oh, yeah. What it says, like the 40 by 40, towns will do that. 40 top CEOs are under 40 or something. Ugh.
Sure. Or, I see this a lot. It just comes down to like owning certain things, having a certain type of car or other, things related to your home or whatever. And, I'm not opposed to owning awesome stuff. Like there are some amazing, cars and homes and other types of technology and so forth that can be really great in your life. But there's a reason to have those things, and I think there's reasons not to, right? If that's kind of what your metric for success is, I just think that that's problematic.
Yeah, I see this all the time. It's, if you really want that set of golf clubs, great. But if you're like, I'm buying this so I can go show Billy and Tommy and Susan, look at this set of golf clubs. It's like $1 million. I don't know. That's probably not the right headspace.
It's probably, and you know what? It's probably not going to actually improve your golf game that much.
That I just drive the cart, and buy the beer. So, what's the other one? Trophy spouses.
Yeah.
And my kids look at my attractive spouse and my kids who went to the perfect colleges and got the perfect job titles.
Yeah. It's great. It's great to be proud of your kids and to aspire for your kids to do good things. But, I think it's about the intent here, that the intent matters. And, are you doing these things just so that you can brag about them or not? Another one I see are kind of like the epic vacations where it's like, oh, we did X, Y, or Z. And it was like, we had our own butler in this thing on the Amalfi Coast and stuff. Now that's great. That could be really fun. And I would love to do that too. But it's about the kind of the social comparison that can occur, where it's like I'm doing this because so that I can get the picture for the Instagram, right? Or basically brag about it to everybody else. And we see this all the time. If you notice it, right? These are the metrics essentially that people are using for their own self-worth, for their own success. And you and I have talked about how this is kind of the unthinking path, the unintentional path, the default mode that we go through sometimes.
Right. It's also another idea, this idea of reflected sense of self or other validated sense of self. If you don't have a solid core of who you are, which I will say is brutal to develop, I'm still working on it every day, right? But one of the unique skills that we develop as humans initially is this ability to self-soothe, right? And we develop that when, you start teaching your baby to go to sleep on their own, right? And then you go in the next room and you just want to cry because you can't go to sleep because they're figuring it out. But eventually that child learns to self-soothe itself. And that's such an important emotional skill to have as an adult person, right? Especially when so let's talk about this idea of how that plays out. So we know how to self-soothe, but very quickly we learn to trick other people into soothing us. Oh, I just look so horrible. Oh no, honey, you look great. And you get maybe a jolt of other validation, but you know that other validation isn't real, right? You know deep down that you tricked that person, but we build up these complex maps in our minds of other people need to validate us to feel okay, rather than digging in, growing up as a person, developing that moral compass, and being able to be self-validated. So the two skills there is can you self-validate, right? And then can you self-soothe the inevitable disappointment you will cause the numbskulls that will disapprove of your ethical decision-making?
Yeah. And this goes back to this idea of kind of differentiation and being able to stand on your own two feet with your own decisions and own your decisions and own your own leadership path. And this is kind of, it brings us to this idea of, we talk about the unintentional path towards kind of choosing your metrics for success, but there is an intentional path that you can take, and we would suggest is the preferred path. Be intentional about the metrics.
If you get your metrics for success from the numbskulls to your left and right, I'm not making as much money as Nancy, or, I haven't been a CEO of a Fortune 500 by 36, oh my God. But we see that all the time amongst highly motivated, hard-charging people. I'm going to say that's the route to destruction, ending up at the end of your life, estranged from your family probably, and just not in a good place. You have a lot of stuff, but it'll be up. But to Ben's point, the intentional path, it's hard but rewarding.
Right. And I think the first point that we can make here is about what does it mean to choose the intentional path for choosing metrics for your success is, first of all, don't let Ben and Chris tell you what your metrics need to be. You need to be the one, or anyone else for that matter, right? You need to be the one who's deciding what the metrics are. And I would suggest that don't just choose those ones that are necessarily popular. Don't become someone or pursue some goals only because someone else made you think that those are the most important aspects of life.
Yeah, I think of a dear friend of mine, Mark Johnson. I think he's in New Mexico now is where he's living, but he was basically a classic scholar at St. John's College, which, they do the great books curriculum.
Right.
And he's teaching in the K through 12 environment. That guy was so smart, could have done anything, but that wasn't his metric for success, I think he's got a croquet team started there. I mean, he's the kind of guy that looks great in a cardigan. I mean, brilliant person, right? And he's running his own goals. His life is thriving and vibrant.
Right. Because he took the path of deliberate intention and thinking about, what mattered for him, right? So I think the first thing is you need to be the one who decides your own metrics. And this brings us to this idea of happiness. Like, I don't really even know what happiness is. It's hard to define, but I do think, and I think there's some good, philosophic and psychological thought that would suggest that just pursuing happiness is problematic. If that's the only thing that you're seeking.
Now, happiness is, I think of it as drugs, right? When you're having, I know, right? So, when you seek happiness for most people is this emotional state generated by a chemical reality in your person, right? And, if you stay at a certain level of stimulation, you actually need more to maintain that same mental state. And I don't know if anybody would say, like, you should be on drugs 100% of the time type thing. Like, even the guys that support, legalization and all that kind of stuff, I don't know any person I just really respect that would say, like, you need to be on a happiness drug, right? Now, if you need medications for diabetes, we're not talking about that. But so don't be a druggie for happiness. Like, that's because it's not sustainable.
It isn't. And because kind of what you're referring to there is that we habituate very quickly to certain levels of things that may give us happiness, and then it doesn't do it anymore.
It's called hedonic adaptation.
Yes.
So,
exactly.
And we see research. So let's say you got a $200,000 raise. I mean, that'd be a lot of money, right? And first few months, you're like, woohoo. But then, after your fleet of Teslas and vacations, very quickly, that 200 grand doesn't do it for you anymore.
Right.
Yeah, so you've tapped into something that's not sustainable. Just like a company that pursues an unsustainable strategy, you've pursued an unsustainable strategy for your life.
That's right. And so a different path, maybe a more intentional path, and one that's potentially more rewarding, is the path of seeking meaning in your life. And again, it comes back to you need to decide what meaning is for you. What is your purpose? And there's a great book, and we'll put a link to this in the show notes. But if you haven't read "Man's Search for Meaning" by Viktor Frankl, he was it's a great book. He was a Jewish psychiatrist. Yeah, he was a Jewish psychiatrist who was in the concentration camps during World War II, and he talks about even within that horrific experiences, how they were able to find moments of joy and meaning and beauty, and going back to this idea of you need to be the one who decides what meaning is for you and pursue that, because happiness will come as a byproduct thereof.
Yeah, like I can't think of a whole lot of happy moments during the first 6 weeks of either of my I mean, they were there, but it wasn't all happiness in the first 6 weeks of either of my kids' life. The sleep depravity and the what.
But it's tough.
Daggone it. There was a lot of meaning, right?
Right.
And that's awesome.
Yeah, right. I think another practical thing that you can do, that we all can do, if you're going down this intentional path of creating the metrics for success in your life, is do stuff for yourself that's going to make you more able to contribute meaningfully to the world. We weren't born with an ability and with the knowledge or skills to necessarily, contribute in a way. We have to do that through education, through our experiences. But that can be a path towards developing some meaning and developing some purpose by developing yourself, right? Build your own knowledge and skills.
Right. And, for the philosophers out there, can you define meaning? Right.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be a key piece for you. How do you define meaning? And then once you do that, can you share your perspective with the world? The poor lieutenants that I had and fellow captains back in the, 4th Alabama was an infantry unit I was in. Like, gosh, this guy will never shut up about reading this book, listen to this podcast. Hey, did you read that article I texted you? But now a bunch of them are avid readers that are really exploring, and they're infecting others with the knowledge of better ways. You have that ripple effect on others. You will probably never address Davos, right? Very few people do. But that doesn't mean you can't have a massive ripple effect impact just by developing yourself so you can contribute.
Right. And that's because these human relationships that we develop over time, they really do matter. And I think it's important for us to consider how we want to be remembered by the people with whom we're interacting. And remembering that every moment that you have with another person is an opportunity for you to, the way I like to think of it is kind of breathe life into the situation or breathe death into the situation. Can you make that, a moment that matters, or is it something where you're going to either kind of treat it passively or potentially even make it a negative experience? And this isn't saying that I do this perfectly. Like, this is a daily grind to try to be intentional about how you interact with people, because our default mode isn't always to be this beacon of integrity to everybody. So I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah, and it's important to give yourself a break, especially for those, for my friends who are rule followers, oh no, how I need to just do this. Oh my gosh. If you're into CrossFit or weightlifting, recovery is just as important as your training hour or two, right?
Right.
So, I view it as phases. You dip into some growth mode, you go through a period of intense reading, reflection, growth. Then you take a little bit of a break to consolidate that learning, right?
Right.
Reflect on it. Practice those new skills. You can't read a highly technical, we always say this, you can't hand somebody a book on boxing and tell them to go get in the ring. Well, let's say you had the most perfect book on boxing with every little detail in it. If you can do everything in this book, you can beat anybody in the world. You still got to read it piecemeal. Practice piecemeal, because that's just how we grow as humans. So don't stress out about this. Just start your journey and make constant steps along the way.
Yeah. And this is just such an important part of kind of internal leadership, right? Being the leader you need yourself to be, because that allows you to be the leader that others may need around you. And I think kind of a final point on this idea of being intentional about what your metrics for success are. Know what you care about, right? This is a simple statement, but it's a big idea, and it's something that I think we all should, pay attention to and think about on a systematic basis. What are your non-negotiables? What are your principles that you will not violate? And by having that level of kind of moral development, you will be able to figure out what the right path is, right? You start with those values and what you want to become, and that will then inform your decision making in a way that gets you along that path.
Yeah, and there's this idea of imposter syndrome, right? Where people just, you don't have to worry about that so much if you have integrity, right?
Right.
If you have a strong moral compass, you can go in and make the right decisions, which means when you don't know something, you don't fake it, right? They say a professional knows what they know, knows what they don't know, and the difference, and knows to go find out those things they don't know. You can be a professional and execute well because you're not an imposter when it comes to your integrity. There's this idea, and tons of people can this a lot of ways, this idea of authentic leadership. Well, that authentic leadership that can inspire others only comes about by being internally consistent and having those values that you can be consistent against.
Right. If you're authentically a jerk, it's not going to help you.
Well, and unless you're like in one of those Wolf of Wall Street firms, right? So
right.
So scoundrels sometimes do win. It's true. But I don't know how happy those scoundrels are at the end of their life after they've invested everything into a sham life.
That's right.
All right, Ben, so why don't you summarize what we talked about today?
Sure. So today we talked about how will you measure your life, a topic that's important for all of us, and it certainly is particularly relevant with regard to our careers and how we interact with other people in organizations. We talked about what it means to create a strategy for your life. We talked about ethics and integrity and how they matter because people remember. And we talked finally about choosing your metrics for success. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.